Dr. Tharoor was here 6 years ago in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, and I had the good fortune of being able to spend a good 90 minutes chatting with him on a variety of topics, and most of his responses were extremely inspiring, and the rest were extremely witty and exciting, to say the least. So I'm extremely delighted that we are going to have a sequel here today. Dr. Tharoor is back this evening in Colombo, and I really am looking forward to exchanging ideas, challenging him on certain things, and getting his inspiring and exciting responses as always. Looking forward to the evening chat with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So, Dr. Tharoor, it's such a delight to have you back.
Good to be back. It's been 6 years.
With us. Yeah, absolutely. 6 years. And I distinctly remember when we did that whole session in Colombo 6 years ago. The outcome after when I shared it with friends was people were really inspired, engaged, excited by a lot of the things that you said. So when I heard that you were coming back here, and I said, well, a sequel has to happen. And even though this is an abridged version compared to what we did last year, I'm really honored and delighted, and thank you so much for making time.
Good to see you, Santosh. I'm glad to see you doing so well here in Colombo.
Thank you, sir. So, first question. So, October 9th was IFS Day, which is International Indian Foreign Service Day. And I texted all my friends here in the High Commission, congratulating them on the fantastic job they had done with what happened in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And the response of the High Commission in terms of how they galvanized forces within India and made sure that a neighbor in trouble was helped out at its time of utmost need. So my sense is that the MEA and the way it operates, at least the way I've seen it in Sri Lanka, is exemplary and fantastic. And I wanted your views on that. But I want to move further. Actually, there are two questions to this. In the recent past, the pronouncements of S. Jaishankar, who's a foreign minister, seems to have a certain muscular assertiveness to it in the way he expresses India's position with clarity. And given the changing dynamics in the global order, it's very interesting to see that level of clarity in terms of what India's position should be on key issues. And having to express that with such conviction makes one feel rather proud. So I wanted to hear your views, because some of his articulations are Tharoor-esque, if I might use the word.
I don't know if that's a compliment to him or not, but let me say that I'm a big fan of the MEA. I think it's a very, very good ministry. I think its problem is that it's deeply short-staffed. I think that we have about the same number of professional diplomats as New Zealand or Singapore, which are tiny countries by comparison with India and its globe-straddling interests and responsibilities. So when I was chairman of the External Affairs Committee of Parliament, I fought very hard to expand the size of the MEA. And to some degree, this is gradually happening. But it takes a while to see that impact, because the expansion, such as it is happening only at the entry levels. And then you have to wait for the people hired now to acquire the experience and become part of a strong, effective tooth, as it were, of the country abroad. But I would say that for India, it's extremely important to have an effective foreign ministry, and, as you say rightly, to station people abroad who have a commitment to achieving results where they are. We can't have the old days of process-oriented bureaucracy and diplomacy, where it's more important to make sure the form is right than worry about the impact. Today, a lot of the work that diplomats are doing is cutting-edge stuff, as you said, in Sri Lanka. There's serious economic diplomacy required, and there is also work to heal really deeply troubled situations in foreign countries that matter to us. I have always argued, even when I was minister, that we need to have an acknowledgement of asymmetrical relationships in the subcontinent. We are so much bigger than our neighbors in terms of both size, population, and GDP, that we undoubtedly displace more weight around the table when we sit with our neighbors. So all the more reason why we should give more than we take. And I think that's been India's approach in places like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh, and so on. And so it should be. I think so it should be. So I'm very supportive of our boys and the girls as well, and the approach they've taken here in Sri Lanka. On Jaishankar, I think he speaks with great clarity. He has a very quick mind. I've known Jaishankar for a long time. After all, he used to be a career diplomat at a time when many of us were sort of dealing with the foreign ministry. In my case, even serving in the foreign ministry as minister when he was one of our ambassadors. And he's a very able, very quick-witted, well-spoken person. I think the only issue on which I've parted company with him is when some of his pronouncements for domestic audiences seem to exceed what is wise internationally. That is, that in these days, it is not possible for us to think that you can say one thing at home and something else in a foreign medium or to a foreign audience, because in the world of instant communication, social media, internet, and so on, all communication is global. Something
Yes.
I say to you now could easily whip up a controversy internationally tomorrow if I didn't watch my words. And I think once or twice, Jaishankar, being relatively new to politics, has found himself caught up in the enthusiasm of rabble-rousing within his own party. I mean, there was a comment or two to the Bharatiya Yuva Morcha, the youth wing of his party, at Kavan Park in Bangalore, that I think he must have been mortified when it made headlines nationally and internationally, because it was really not what a foreign minister would say about foreign countries. And that led me to urge him to cool it, because that cooling it was not about his deliberately crafted international pronouncements. It was about being a little careful about things you say inside the country,
Sure.
not intending them to be heard abroad, but which they get heard abroad anyway.
Sure. But further moving forward, how do you see the relations between India and Sri Lanka now that India has kind of demonstrated its positive intent to helping a country out in trouble?
Absolutely. I think, and what's more, it's very much appreciated. I've just seen President Ranil Wickremesinghe. I've seen Foreign Minister Ali Sabri. And I must say that they are very warm and receptive towards India. They feel that India has been a loyal and helpful friend. And I must say that the language that I've heard used about my country and its representatives and ministers is very gratifying for an Indian. For me, that's wonderful. I think we have nowhere to go but up. As you know, there was a free trade agreement, and already 60% of Sri Lanka's exports to India are covered by the old free trade agreement, but they're now negotiating an even more all-encompassing agreement, which might take perhaps 95% of Sri Lanka's exports into India into its ambit. And there would be hope for overcoming the few differences that remain. The negotiations are going on. I ran into a lady in this hotel where you and I are talking,
Yes.
who had come as part of the Indian negotiating delegation and came up and said hello. So there's a lot happening. And I think it's very good that we are seeing more progress in this kind of area. If we can move to a real economic partnership between the two countries, it'll do everyone some good. And I think the cultural affinities are already there. The president is somebody who has come to Tirupati and prayed there, wants to come back again to visit some of the temples of Kerala. And I would love to welcome him there. Many of us in India feel a lot of warmth for Sri Lanka. And I know that it's reciprocated for the most part. And then if you look at the areas that are important, education, health, tourism, these are all areas where India and Sri Lanka have obvious partnership opportunities that, for example, China could not provide in the same way. So I don't think that there's very much competition for India in terms of the closeness that Sri Lanka feels for another country.
That's really nice to hear, sir. Further on India's position in the world, given all of the dramatic changes happening geopolitically, the bipolar world no longer exists, and I've heard you use the word of multi-alignment, and you also mentioning that the foreign ministers nowadays kind of borrowed the word from you as well.
He was good enough to acknowledge that he had.
He did that. So where is this entire where is this puzzle heading? Where are all the pieces falling? How do you see this going? Because it's very, very interesting given the fluidity that's currently going on with all of the countries kind of forming alliances with each other.
That's right.
One really doesn't know who's an ally, who's not anymore.
Well, that's because I think in many ways the way to look at the pattern of global connections these days is rather like the internet, the World Wide Web. It's that one country is connected to another country, and that country is connected to a third country, but the first country and the third country may not have enough in common to have a relationship. So you've got all these networks. The world is a networked world now. And the way it works very often is that you can add and subtract for different purposes. I mean, India, the foreign minister meets with his Russian and Chinese counterparts every year. It's something called RIC. Then they add the Brazilians and the South Africans and they have BRICS. Then they subtract the Russians but keep the Chinese and they have BASIC for environmental negotiations. Wow. And then they kick out the Chinese also from that and they have IPSA for South-South cooperation.
Sure.
And in all of these sort of alphabet soup organizations, India is present and contributing, and not merely because its name begins with a vowel, which is indispensable in the acronym, but also because I think these are different configurations in which it can make a contribution and it can benefit. And many countries are functioning that way. I use the Indian example because that's where I'm from, but I'm sure you'll find other examples in other countries where that kind of what you might call minilaterals or plurilaterals are taking place amidst the global world order. But having said that, when you say the world is no longer bipolar, I'd say we have a 2 or even 3-tier world. At the first tier, there is now, I think, a return to bipolarity between America and China. There is a very clear rivalry, and both countries are eligible for the term superpower, and at the same time, China as an economy is already growing in purchasing power parity terms. It's probably going to be ahead of the US very soon. And in nominal terms, in dollar terms, it's not very far behind. It will catch up by another decade or so. So we're looking at two big powers, and that will be bipolar because they are mutually suspicious of each other. It won't be like the Cold War. The problem in the Cold War was there was really no connection between America and Russia. Whereas with China, there's a lot of American investments in China, absolutely. Chinese travel back and forth, etc. It's not quite the same world, but there is nonetheless a rivalry. And the next tier is a multipolar tier, where you've got a number of countries that are regional powers, influential in their own backyards, who are powers to be reckoned with and could even, in certain areas, serve as counterweights to the big two. And those would be countries like Russia, Britain, France, and indeed India, which has been growing both economically and in population terms, and is, it seems to me, in a position to be one of the poles at that second tier. And then below that, one could argue, would be the rest. So there are some evolutions. I mean, in Africa, perhaps Nigeria and South Africa and their respective sub-regions are already becoming sort of poles in their own right. And others might well grow. I mean, we have forgotten to mention Japan. Japan is a significant player in northeastern Asia, and so on. So I think bipolar at the top, multipolar the second tier, and then the rest below is more or less what I would see.
So on that topic, I also hear from friends who are in the Ministry of External Affairs when we talk about India providing an alternative to the BRI route through earlier there was a plan to connect Gwadar port to Armenia and then go to Europe. And recently we've had this whole IMEC tie-up through Haifa and connection to Saudi Arabia and then from there to Europe. So, I mean, how do you see this playing out? Is this a...
Well, India has rightly been very skeptical of BRI for two principal reasons. One, we found it an affront to our sovereignty that they built this corridor through territory that is in dispute, namely the portion of Kashmir that Pakistan holds. And so we were affronted by that. But equally, we're very skeptical about the debt burden that China is imposing on a number of countries who have taken loans under the BRI. Sri Lanka, unfortunately, is a poster child for this phenomenon, where they found themselves very deeply indebted to the Chinese, Hambantota and so on, as an example of where that leads. Now, IMEC is an interesting alternative, but currently with the events going on in Gaza, there is a worry that a route that depends so much on going through the Middle East, through an Israeli port, Haifa, and through Saudi Arabian land, is at the moment hostage to the evolution of the situation. We all hope and pray it doesn't get worse, and that a peaceful outcome will be not too long away. But if instead it intensifies and other countries are caught up in a conflagration, then the kind of peaceful initiatives for development and travel and trade that IMEC presupposes are not likely to be feasible for a while.
Okay, Dr. Tharoor, we're going to shift tracks a little bit. Something which you love, which I love too, and I think most Indians do, which is cricket.
Ah, yes.
So I mean, when you look at the Indian cricket team now, I'm using a word which I never thought I would use for an Indian cricket team, which is dominant. And when I say dominant, what I mean is there have been patches in our history, at least in the last 30, 40 years, where we may have shown signs of becoming a true, well balanced side who are world beaters. Perhaps 85, when Sunil Gavaskar's team went and won the Mini World Series Cup in Australia, where we never lost a game. Similarly, I think there was one World Cup in the late 90s, which was held in India, which was a Reliance Cup, which we thought we would win, but ultimately we didn't.
No,
That was 96, was it?
87 and 96
87.
were both. Reliance Cup was 87.
87.
And I would say that in both cases, we did pretty well in the league games, ended up losing in the semi-finals in
Yeah.
both cases. And my big fear is that shouldn't happen in 2023.
Yeah, so let's not jinx it, but I'm actually thinking of it from a different context. Just as India seems to be transforming into an economic power of repute, you now have this cricket team which actually seems to be speaking a different kind of language, each individual having a certain attitude, having a certain mindset. There seems to be a lot of clarity, professionalism. Again, if I might use the earlier words, a certain muscular assertiveness.
You're a big fan of muscular assertiveness.
It's just a term which actually occurred to me before the interview, so I thought I'd use it as a connecting factor. But there seems to be that element as well. And I read an article of yours where you kind of connected cricket to India's transformation. So I wanted to hear more about that, because that's a rather fascinating analogy.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm still one of those purists who thinks the highest form of the game is Test cricket. And until we win the World Championship of Test cricket, I won't ever use the word dominant for India, because the problem with India is we can win against anybody at any time in any format, but we can also lose. And that's the big worry I have. I would love to see India win this World Cup. As you say, it's been a flawless machine, this team so far. And as you and I are speaking, they've won their first 6 games, and they're poised for their 7th against Sri Lanka, the very country you and I are sitting in right now. I think the only match remaining for which there is a likely uncertainty to the outcome is South Africa. Otherwise, India seems likely to end up with at least 8 wins out of 9. That's hugely impressive, and perhaps even 9. Let's see. Having said that, once you get to the knockout stage, none of that matters. If you lose your semi-final, you're out of the tournament, end of story. And we've done that a couple of times. I think we've lost 3 or 4 semi-finals in the World Cup over the years, and 1 final. So I don't want to count my chickens just yet. On the World Test Championship, I think we have a lot going for us. I was at the World Test Championship final in London just last summer. And I was disappointed to see that in neutral territory, this was after all England, and the 2 sides contesting were India and Australia, that we simply could not compete. And that's a bit dismaying, if you don't mind me saying so, because we've got to be, if you're a dominant side, you've got to be able to win against anybody and anywhere.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. So, we've been talking of the muscular assertiveness of India, a different context to India, which is changes everywhere. And obviously, India as a country, India as an idea, seems to be evolving and taking its own shape. A lot of it, what we now discussed in terms of our foreign affairs, how we conduct it, in terms of our cricket, there is a certain element of pride and delight, even in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, in certain other aspects, there is a certain amount of disquiet in the way India seems to be going forward. So, as a very wise person yourself and such a knowledgeable person yourself, I want to do this small little exercise with you, right? So I've got all of these books and the titles of the books, and I want you to crystal gaze and tell me, which direction do you think India is going to go in the next 20, 30 years? So I've got a few names of books, and tongue-in-cheek some of them, right? So I think, I'm sure you'll pardon me if they're a little bit extra tongue-in-cheek, but one is The Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. The other is The God of Small Things, contextual. The Era of Darkness, I surely hope not. The India Way by S. Jaishankar. The Anarchy, William Dalrymple. The Fractured Himalaya, and you know what that's talking about. And the last one India after the Gandhis. Okay, I mean, actually, it's India after Gandhi, but I'm just being a little tongue in cheek here. But I really wanted to hear your response. Where do you think India is headed in the next 20, 30
Well,
years?
you know, any sort of speculation is just that. You're trying to infer trends from what's going on today, but there could be dramatic changes. My own view is that India has a certain uh, capacity for influence in the world, which can only grow. As our population grows and our economy grows, we will have that ability to actually make an impact on the world. And I've often argued that on everything from cyberspace to outer space, we are major players. We're one of a handful of countries that have the expertise, the resources, the human capacity to be actually able to make rules and not just obey them. Which is why I want India to be a little more assertive, not necessarily muscular, but to be prepared to take more initiatives on some of these issues. But for that, we need both conceptual clarity and very firm decision making. I thought that, for example, our decision to abstain on the vote calling for an end to the continuing bombardment of Gaza was an unfortunate error of judgment. Because, in my view, uh, the logic that we have expressed in our explanation of vote, that the resolution should also have condemned the terror attack on the people of Israel, 7th of October, that explanation of vote could have been delivered after voting for the ceasefire. The French did exactly that, and so could we. In many ways, there's a lot of affinity between the French approach to the world and ours. And I would have said that this is one case where they did better than us, because it was wrong to stand on the wrong side of history when it comes to essentially opposing a resolution that was asking for human lives to be saved so that humanitarian aid could reach them. Secondly, it was also wrong to feel that the only way in which we could push this concern about terrorism, which I share, which all of us share, we cannot condone terrorism, and terrorism, if it ignites a reprisal, many say, well, they asked for it, kind of thing. But beyond a point, when the reprisals or retribution becomes so overwhelmingly disproportionate that thousands of lives are lost and more thousands are in danger, then I think it is the right thing for the land of Mahatma Gandhi to call for peace and to call for some sort of willingness to find a different way forward. I think we would have done ourselves more credit if we had been very clear that we could have said what we said while voting in a way that preserves our credibility. One of the strengths of India's approach to the G20 was its desire to portray itself as the voice of the global South. But the honest truth, Santosh, is that you cannot be the leading voice of the global South if the entire global South is voting one way at the UN and you are standing alone abstaining. In fact, there was a very nasty but understandably justified comment by a critic on social media saying, why does India even want a permanent seat in the Security Council? Is it only to abstain on more difficult issues? And that kind of thing is not what India should be hearing. And I would like to see, that's the only caveat to what you said. We need to see much more clarity and a much more firm and decisive view of where we fit in the world that is manifested in what we say and how we say it.
But the future for India, I mean, how do you see it?
I think that we should first of all attend to our domestic concerns. I think the worry is that some of the divisive politics promoted within our country by associates of the ruling party do threaten our social harmony, and that's something that will undermine our credibility in the world unless it's rapidly resolved. Apart from that, I think India as a country has tremendous credibility, impact, and standing in the world, linked now to a larger, growing, and prosperous economy, and an ability and willingness to actually play an influential role in global councils. India could become a very significant player, one that punches above its weight. I was interested today that the president of Sri Lanka was recalling India's stature when it stood up against Britain, France, and Israel on the Suez Crisis of 1956. He said that was when India was on a pedestal we all admired, and I think it's good to remind us that we used to stand for the loftiest aspirations of the global South before that term was even fashionable.
Yeah. So, a topic we discussed 6 years ago when you were here, and it's now crystallized into something very specific: WhatsApp universities. And the damage that WhatsApp universities seem to be doing in terms of creating or fueling disharmony. I just wanted your view on it. And is there anything, in the 6 years, how does one really handle that?
I mean, one gets so much of nonsense forwarded, and of course,
And
so
people
many
believe it.
Yeah, I mean, people tend to be credulous, and it's partly going back to the days when anything you saw in print you believed. Because
Yes.
Of course, that was not an unreasonable position to take because print had to go through various fact-checking exercises and editing and proofreading and copying. So by the time it came out in print, it was fine. Uh, but now, unfortunately, the kind of stuff that goes on WhatsApp, no one has proofed it, no one has checked it, no one has fact researched it. It just goes out there, and very often, if it's interesting enough, it becomes viral without people at any point knowing whether it's right or wrong. Now, of course, if you have the patience to go on fact-checking sites, you might well find that some story you found very exciting was actually not
absolutely.
true. But how many of us have the time that every time we find an interesting story we're tempted to forward, we first go put it on a fact check?
Yeah.
I mean, I just received something today. It was so blatantly wrong at every level. I was amazed that a classmate would forward it. It was a video of a football coach running back and forth in Europe. The audience is all white and they're all wearing warm clothing. So obviously a football match in winter. Claiming that this was the South African coach Morne Morkel, excited to see his team winning, and suddenly realizing it was the coach of the losing side, Pakistan. Clever caption, so it was going around almost virally, except that none of the elements correspond. It wasn't Morne Morkel. Anyone who's seen him would know that. The audience wasn't in India, and the clothing suggested the climate was different anyway. So within the 5 seconds of thought, you would realize this forward is wrong.
Absolutely.
And yet it's being forwarded.
Yes.
And it's going around. So it's an example of the fact that
it's kind of like a headline mentality. You like the headline, you're saying something interesting, you want to forward it
Right.
despite anything. Last question, and I want to keep to the 30 minutes that we promised, given your paucity of time and pressing engagements ahead. Very often when one talks to successful people, one gets to hear, and even when you read books written by successful people, you get to hear this whole thing saying, keep focus on one thing that you're passionate about and you'll be successful. But when I see you, sir, and I see your varied interests, in fact, I saw you do a stand-up comedy the other day, and it was absolutely fantastic. I think you had such a fantastic sense of timing in terms of saying the right things at the right point to make everybody laugh. So I remember 6 years ago, I listed the various things you do. And I think in the last 6 years, I've probably doubled that to few more things, which means stand-up comedian, and now you're also a grandfather. So I think
That's true.
all of things get all those things get added. But I really wanted your opinion on it because this recently, there was a study done somewhere in Stanford where they said 75% of the people in the world really don't have one thing they care about. Most people have a variety of interests. But because everyone says choose your passion, people suppress natural instincts and end up doing one thing which perhaps they're not in love with. Whereas I think with you, when I see the fact that you seem to manage your politics well, you seem to do your tweeting extremely consciously and by yourself, you are able to manage all of these engagements. And I don't think it's purely a question of time management. It's a question where you've actually taken a conscious decision. This is what I want to do. So I want to hear more about it. More than me, what I think I would like you to address this to the young people in the country who are looking at their own lives and thinking, should I do one thing? Or should I follow all of my passions?
Well, look, I think it depends very much on the individual. In my case, this is the only way I can be because I have very many interests and perhaps talents that I feel need the space to be tried out. And at the same time, each is important in its own way. And sometimes it's a question of the priorities you allocate when you're in active politics. Political obligations take precedence. When you're coming to another country to make speeches, something else takes precedence. When you're at a literary festival promoting your books, it's a third thing that takes precedence, and so on and so forth. But having said that, I mean, when you were speaking, I was reminded of a comment made by a retired Sri Lankan diplomat, Guy Amrithanayagam, who was settled in America and wrote book reviews. And he wrote a review of one of my books, which he liked very much and praised. And then he said, if only this man would give up his day job. I was at the United Nations in those days. What a great writer he might be. which was actually a way of saying that he's not as good as he could be because he does too many things.
Yeah.
And that was the criticism that I took to heart, but I realized I couldn't be anything else. I wanted to inhabit both the world of conclusions and the world of decisions. I wanted to be both in the world of action and the world of reflection. And so all of this meant that I had to keep my writing and my UN work, and now my writing and my politics, and the speaking and so on accompanies both those professions. So it's a question of, that's the only way I can be. Whether others would feel the same degree. Ultimately, when George Bernard Shaw was asked about his writing, he said, I write for the same reason a cow gives milk. I mean, it's completely basic to you. And to some degree, that's true of me as well. I write because I feel I have to. That's the way in which I express myself, the way in which others would talk or run or play tennis or whatever it is. It's a passion. But having said that, it's also true that if you don't do it, a cow is not milked. The cow will actually be in pain and will need to be milked. And that's essentially where I come down. That if I allow a part of my psyche to wither on the vine, I will feel a great deal of distress and discomfort, that I've lost out something that is essential to my sense of being and self-worth. Now, that may not be true to everybody else. So I don't want to preach to the young and say, do be like me. In fact, they might take Guy Amritha Naigam's advice and say, no, let me focus on one thing, do it very, very well, and be respected for it, rather than stretching myself too much in too many directions. And, I do feel sometimes that it would be nice to have a lighter life and fewer hours and sleep longer and watch cricket and dandy my grandchildren on my knee. I haven't watched a single full match of the World Cup, and that's something that I rather regret. In 2011, when I was perhaps a little less overstretched, I actually personally attended with my late wife 4 or 5 of the matches, 4 of the matches anyway, and had a wonderful time. And those are the pleasures of life that one denies oneself when one tries to do too much. So, for the young people, the answer would be, if there's more that you want to do, do it. Don't deny yourself the satisfaction of doing more. But if it's too onerous, if you feel you're burning your candle at both ends and so on, stop. Focus on the one thing that matters most to you. And that's entirely up to you as an individual.
I said last question, but I want to make this last one 2-minute question. Brief question, but something that keeps getting asked when I talk about you, which is, can Dr. Tharoor become more in the political field in terms of where he is, in terms of position, in terms of stature, so that he can make a significant difference to the future of India?
Look, I'm trying, Santosh. I mean, it's not that I've been taking a sabbatical from politics. I've been doing everything else while being very active in politics. I have won 3 elections, and I'm looking forward to fighting a 4th. So there's certainly a need for me to demonstrate that my commitment is real. And when I'm in the political space, when there are political commitments, they do take precedence over everything else. And I will say that in the next few months, I was asked, in fact, by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who has read a lot of my books, what's next? And I said, I've taken a break from serious writing until the elections are over, because you can't begin a book project and mortgage your imagination to it when you've got to think about election strategies and work.
Sure.
So right now, that will take precedence. But I will say that what opportunities you get in politics is often not in your hands. You do your best, and the Bhagavad Gita teaches us this. Do the right thing, do the thing right, but don't think about the reward. It may or may not come.
On that note, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor.
Thanks very much.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, Santosh.